Welcome to the Qasim Rashid Show, a civil rights lawyer here to expose all forms of injustice with a sprinkling of dad jokes in between. Here's your host, Qasim Rashid.
Good morning and peace be upon you this beautiful Sunday, wherever you're tuning in from. My name is Qasim Rashid, and this is the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View Channel 126, the most awesome show in the multiverse, welcoming our listeners from Substack as well. Thank you for being here. As always, I want to thank you all for tuning in. Your emails, your notes, your DMs are amazing. I'm grateful you all listen to the show and grateful you share it with family and friends. There's nothing I enjoy more than someone saying that listening to your show helped me get a better understanding of this complex issue that I thought was complex. That's the goal here. We're trying to make things easier to understand, especially in a world where there's so much misinformation and disinformation. I was reading a recent study that shows that only 32% of people trust legacy media now. 32%. And a lot of it has to do with so much corporate media being driven by what's going to get clicks rather than what's going to actually report just what the on-the-ground reality is. We saw the New York Times take it on the chin when The Intercept leaked a memo telling in the New York Times where they're not allowed to use the words genocide or massacre to address what's happening to Palestinians. And, this is particularly egregious because the ratio was like 53-1 of the way they described massacre for the atrocities of 10/7 versus the way they described the atrocities since 10/7, where more than 34,000 Palestinians have been killed. And we got a lot to cover in today's show. We're gonna cover, of course, what's happening in Gaza. I also want to talk about some viral memes about Muslims and Jews that need to be addressed. We're going to talk about what's happening right now in Rafah. And I also want to talk about expanding the Supreme Court and the reason we need to do it desperately if we have any hope of protecting our democracy long term. But first, I want to start with a clip of Piers Morgan. The British journalist, commentator, pundit Piers Morgan. And, I like to give credit where due. I've been super critical of Piers Morgan in the past. I believe he said some ridiculous things and has taken some ridiculous positions. But on this interview, where he's interviewing an Israeli spokesperson, he asks him a very simple question. He asks him, how many civilians has the Israeli government killed? And normally, and this is one reason why in the past I haven't been a big fan of Piers Morgan, normally they'll give some, random non-answer and Piers will move on. But listen closely, because the way he digs in, it's about a 5-minute interview. So just, you have to bear with me, but I promise you, it's very entertaining. Just listen to how he digs in and holds the spokesperson accountable. I wish more journalists did this. I wish Piers did this more often. But take a listen, and I'll be right back after this quick interview with Piers Morgan and an Israeli spokesperson.
How many civilians do you believe you've killed?
We don't have exact figures, as you know, it's the fog of war.
But you've got exact numbers for Hamas terrorists you've killed. Why wouldn't you know how many civilians you've killed?
Because obviously our focus is to go after the Hamas terrorists. And
hang on, that does imply that you're putting a bigger premium on killing Hamas terrorists in terms of numbers and accountability than you are on innocent civilians. That can't be right, surely. If you know exactly how many Hamas terrorists you've killed, you must know how many civilians you've killed. Otherwise, you're prioritizing the lives of terrorists over innocent people.
Piers, with respect, don't put words into my mouth, please. I didn't say exactly 14,000. I said around 14,000. Whereas Hamas will come out with precise numbers that statisticians will look at.
Give me a ballpark number for civilians.
Well, you can use the ballpark as far as the Hamas figures, which I reject as being false.
Well, if they're false, why would you give me those?
I gave you the numbers that I had.
No, you've told me you know how many Hamas terrorists you've killed, but you don't seem to have any idea how many civilians you've killed. I'm just bemused. Why wouldn't you keep count of both?
I don't have that information to give you, Piers. If I did, I would.
You've literally no idea how many civilians you've been killing.
I can tell you definitively that our aim is to go after Hamas.
No, hang on. I'm sorry to push you on this. That's quite extraordinary. You're an official spokesman for the Israeli government, and you have no idea how many civilians you've killed. I thought you just told me that you were particularly careful about not killing civilians. But if you don't know how many you've killed, how can you say that with any certainty?
Because even if you were to go by a ratio of the Hamas figures, we would still be far ahead of any
That wasn't my
Western army.
question. You know it wasn't my question.
I don't have the information.
You literally have no idea how many civilians you've killed.
It's not that I don't know. I'm not authorized to give the information. I don't have the information.
That's complete nonsense. Why are you authorized to give me the number of terrorists you've killed, but not the number of civilians? I don't understand. Can you explain?
Piers, we will go after Hamas. We will ensure that we.
But you want me to believe you're being incredibly careful about how many civilians you're killing, and you have an amazing exemplary record, but you don't know how many civilians you're killing. So how do I know you've been careful?
Piers, when the dust settles, we will come out with the proper numbers. Hamas runs to the press daily with false.
When the dust settles, a lot of people will have died, and you know how many Hamas you've killed, but you don't know how many civilians you've killed. And I'm just asking you why. Why is it you've kept a record of one, but not the other?
I personally don't have that information to give to you. You can ask me over and over. I'm not going to come up with more information. I don't.
So you don't know.
I don't have that information for you.
But you're an official government spokesman for the Israeli government, and you have no idea.
Piers, I came on here to focus on what's going on with the war.
Well, actually, you came on here to answer my questions, I think.
Yeah, and I don't have an answer for you for that.
And I didn't intend to press you on this point because I assumed that you would not respond the way you have. But I've never had an Israeli spokesman who simply said, I have no idea. Particularly after you boasted about the fact that you've been very smart in the way you've avoided killing civilians. How do you know if you've got no idea how many you've killed?
Because I know the way in which the IDF operates. I know the way in which we go after the terrorists in the best possible way. It's not what I've said. It's what General Petraeus has said. It's what John Spencer from West Point has said. It's what multiple British generals have said. Israel goes out of its way to avoid civilian casualties. That's what we'll do. If you can point to me to another conflict by which they have evacuated, got out of harm's way civilians to the extent that Israel has done, then fine.
With respect, Mr. Hyman, how can you possibly expect me to accept any comparisons to any other conflict or war, given that you do not know how many civilians you've killed?
Piers, you understand that I can't prosecute the war over the media.
I'm just asking you for basic information. I'm not trying to trap you, and I'm not trying to unfairly harangue you. I think people are watching this and they'll make their own conclusions. I just find it astonishing that the moment I asked you how many Hamas you killed, you could tell me immediately. And the moment I ask you about civilians, you haven't got a clue, literally. That you're not even prepared to issue a ballpark number. And I think people will find that staggering, particularly given that you are insistent that you're doing everything you can to avoid killing civilians. To which, again, I just simply ask, how do you know? If you don't know how many you're killing, how can you possibly be sure that you are, A, doing better than other people waging war elsewhere, or B, that you have any idea how many you're killing? You don't, clearly.
Now, the interview is much longer, but that is an excellent example of holding those in power accountable. And the thing is, there's really only two reasons why this spokesperson would not give an answer about how many civilians they've killed. One is they know the answer, and it's such an egregious number that they cannot defend or justify, that they just don't want to get on record that they're acknowledging any number of civilians they've killed. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that they're so indiscriminate in their bombing that they just genuinely have no idea, and that they're just making up the Hamas number out of thin air as well, and they have no actual idea who they've killed, how many people, how many children, how many women, how many students, how many doctors, how many teachers, how many aid workers, how many journalists. They just have no idea. Those are the only two options. The only two reasons you would refuse to answer that question is because you know, and you know it's egregious, or you don't know, and that in and of itself is an indictment of your lack of care in what you're doing. Either way, it's completely inexcusable. There's no justification for it whatsoever. And I think the American people are catching on to this. A new poll just came out that has some daunting data for President Biden and others in power to think about. This is a new poll that just came out from, I think, Gallup, for Data for Progress, which says that now a majority of Democrats believe Israel is committing genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. The question they asked is very simple. Do you believe that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinian people living in Gaza? And of all likely voters, 39% say yes, 38% say no, 23% are undecided. They don't know. And again, the fact that 2 in 5 say definitely yes, and 1 in 5 say they don't know, we're at 60% who cannot say for certainty that it's not genocide. That's a problem. Among Democrats, 56% say yes, definitely. 22% say undecided. Only 22% say no. Only 1 in 5 Democrats can definitively say no. Even among independents, only 1 in 3 can definitively say no. And among Republicans, only 23% say yes, which we expect the pro-life party never saw a war they didn't like. But we're seeing the Overton window shift. We're seeing people come to realize that, hey, this is fundamentally wrong and flawed here. And the recent news by the State Department that they are not releasing their report on whether Israel is violating international human rights law. They were supposed to release it last week. They've decided we're just going to wait. It's going to be an indefinite delay. We can't give you a timeline anymore. Again, if you're innocent, if you have evidence to prove that you're doing everything right, you run to provide that evidence. You don't hide it. You let people know, hey, here are the facts. We are doing this by the book. It's only when you know full well that you've been violating international human rights law that you're trying to cover this up and trying to prevent. We got a lot to cover on the show. We're going to come back in a few minutes and talk a bit more about what's happening here. We're also going to talk about this bizarre letter by 12 Republican senators to ICC Chief Prosecutor Karim Khan, threatening him and his family if he issues an arrest warrant for Netanyahu. Wild, unprecedented, also a violation of international human rights law. Got a lot to cover. We'll be right back after this break. You're listening to the Qasim Rashid Show. And when we come back, we'll dive deeper into what's happening with this horrific siege and genocide in Gaza. Welcome back. You're listening to the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View Channel 126, the most awesome show in the multiverse. We got a lot to cover today. I wanted to dive in and talk about what's happening in Rafah right now and just how egregious this actually is. But before I get there, I want to talk about kind of the build-up to how we got to this point. I keep hearing this is such a complex issue. I don't know what to think. You guys, that's a talking point that the people who want to perpetuate this war and violence want you to believe. This is not that complicated. It's really, really not. And I'll prove it to you by kind of diving into kind of where we are right now. To date, Israeli bombing has killed more than 34,000 Palestinian civilians. An estimated 70% of them are women and children. And somehow, each day brings a new level of atrocity. And as you listen to this, Israel has begun its invasion of Rafah, contrary to every single tenet of international human rights law. And unless we address and remedy these injustices, the mass killing in the ICJ documented genocide of Palestinians is at risk of escalating to an even greater level somehow of atrocity. So let's really address this. Here are 5 things I want you to consider. First of all, and this should concern anyone. I don't care what side of the political spectrum you're on. This should concern you deeply. Israel has effectively enacted a media blackout. They've just banned Al Jazeera. They've previously banned all Western journalists from entering Gaza and reporting on the war. They've additionally killed somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 journalists in Gaza reporting on the war. And now they've banned Al Jazeera, raiding their offices last Sunday, even seizing some of their equipment. The AP reports the extraordinary order, which includes confiscating broadcast equipment, preventing the broadcast of the channel's reports, and blocking its websites, is believed to be the first time Israel has ever shuttered a foreign news outlet operating in the country. Now, to be clear, this is the first time they've probably raided an office, but they had previously banned CNN, other media outlets from having unfettered access, which is what journalists need to have, especially when reporting in a war zone. Now, Israel has accused, without evidence, of course, that Al Jazeera is, quote, a mouthpiece for Hamas. I mean, everyone is Hamas at this point. The lack of press freedom is particularly dangerous, you guys. And this is not the behavior of a military abiding by international law, right? A military abiding by international law would want to be open and transparent, to say, hey, look, criticize all you want, but you can see transparently we're doing everything right. And this lack of journalists on the ground is especially egregious given the discovery of multiple mass graves in Gaza. At least 3 mass graves have been discovered so far, with upwards of 700 bodies inside of them. It's been dismissed as fake news, which is even more egregious because one of the final steps of genocide is denial. And to make it even more horrifying, many of the corpses show signs of torture and summary execution. We're talking their hands and feet were tied. We're talking execution in the back of the head. Some of them were patients. It's horrifying. And the lack of having journalists on the ground to report on this should make every person think twice about how we move forward in this situation. And so then you look at the next barrier, and that is, well, we have an international criminal court who is supposed to be able to be that stopgap to prevent these kinds of injustice. Sure, they've blocked media, but we have an international criminal court. Well, in a truly unprecedented move, 12 US senators wrote a scathing letter to International Criminal Court Chief Prosecutor Karim Khan, threatening to attack him if he issues arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. This bizarre letter condemns any potential warrant issued as, quote, not only a threat to Israel's sovereignty, but to the sovereignty of the United States as well, which makes no sense whatsoever. How is arresting the prime minister of a foreign country a threat to US sovereignty? It just makes no sense. It continues, target Israel and we will target you. And that any further action will end all American support for the International Criminal Court. To be clear, this is also a violation of international law. But I think probably the most bizarre part about this is the letter goes on to say that they will bar Karim Khan and his families from the United States. You have been warned. What did his family do? Like whatever your beef with the chief prosecutor is, whether it's valid or invalid, that's a different conversation. But how are you going to attack a man's family by virtue of being related to him? And how far does that family go? Are we talking, spouse and children? Are we talking brothers and sisters? Are we talking parents? Are we talking first cousins, second cousins, uncles? Second cousin twice removed? Like, it is such a bizarre and ass backwards attack on one of the most important enforcement mechanisms in the world. And these are the people who talk about how much they love police and defend the police. Well, this is who this guy is. He's law enforcement. Now suddenly you don't like law enforcement? Now you want to defund the police? I mean, the hypocrisy is wild. And again, it is a criminal act to threaten the ICC. And it is a completely nonsensical claim that prosecuting Netanyahu is somehow an attack on the US. But this is where we are. So they're shutting down media access. They're threatening with force any attempt to issue a warrant for Netanyahu. And by the way, the same Republicans and the White House were thrilled when he issued a warrant for Vladimir Putin of Russia, obviously. But now suddenly, because it's their ally, it's a problem. And so then the next point is, well, okay, Hamas should just agree to a ceasefire. And this could be over. That's what we keep hearing, right? Hamas just needs to agree to a ceasefire, and this will end immediately. And we've been telling you since day one that for Israel, this was never about the hostages. That was always the excuse. And it's a shame, and it's horrifying that innocent people's lives who are being held hostage by Hamas are being used as a political football. But this is what Netanyahu has been telling us, and he proved it again last week. Back on May 6th, Hamas accepted a permanent ceasefire and release of all hostages. And the Israeli government said no. The text of the ceasefire agreement is truly remarkable. You should go online and read it for yourself. It mandates release of all Israeli hostages. It ensures a long-term ceasefire, meaning that Hamas could not offensively take up arms against Israel again. And I think this is the part I'm not seeing media report that's really critical. It named Qatar, Egypt, the United States, and the United Nations as guarantors. Hamas agreed to have them be the guarantors that Hamas will uphold its end of the bargain. I mean, if you're Hamas and you're hell-bent on destruction of anything non-you, then why would you want the United States and United Nations to be the guarantors? You do that because in this case, and in this case only, because I do not trust Hamas, in this case, you want to show that, yes, you are committed to an actual ceasefire and that you are committed to giving up the hostages. And Israel still said no. Flat out said no. Said, no, we're not interested. There's a great article in Haaretz about, there's an Israeli outlet, about how Netanyahu was surprised that he got more than what he asked for in the negotiation deal. And he hoped that Hamas would say no, and that when Hamas said yes, he proceeded to actively sabotage the ceasefire deal. Absurd, horrifying. And as a result, there's a fourth point I want you to keep in mind. The invasion of Rafah has begun. I mean, we have consistently heard since October 7th, all Hamas has to do is to release the hostages and the war is over. Hamas agreed to that, and Israel said, nope, sorry, psych, just kidding. It turns out that this was a deadly lie, and countless innocent civilians in Rafah are suffering the most horrific consequences of that lie. Not to mention the hostages are suffering the consequences of that lie. And so speaking of Rafah, the invasion of Rafah has begun, leaving 600,000 children exposed to harm. Immediately after rejecting the ceasefire deal, which, by the way, had everything Israel had demanded to date, the Israeli army began its bombing of Rafah. And remember, Rafah is already overwhelmed with about 1.2 million displaced persons. Rafah is a city that normally has less than 100,000 people. It's got now 12 times that. Wherever you live, imagine if 12 times the number of people arrived and were living in tents. And then you're being bombed. And then think about half of those people, about 600,000 are children. There is nowhere for these people to go. UNICEF reports that more than 200 days of war have taken an unimaginable toll on the lives of children. This is from Catherine Russell. She's a UNICEF executive director. She goes on that Rafah is now a city of children. Rafah is now a city of children who have nowhere safe to go in Gaza. If large-scale military operations start, not only will children be at risk from the violence, but also from chaos and panic, and at a time where their physical and mental states are already weakened. Israel's saying, no, but we're only going to bomb certain areas, and we're advance warning where we're going to bomb and telling people to voluntarily relocate. First of all, there's no such thing as voluntary relocation when the option is leave or be bombed. That's not voluntary. If somebody holds a gun to your head and says, you can choose to leave or you can stay here, it's your choice. That's not voluntary. That's not a choice. You're being threatened with death. That's what a threat literally is. So let's stop with this whitewashing BS of claiming that it's voluntary. It's not. It's not forced relocation. It's ethnic cleansing. It's genocide by the textbook definition. But to go beyond that, let's even assume, for the sake of, let's give Israel every possible credit, even though they deserve none in this space, to say, oh, how thoughtful of them. They are telling advance notice where they're going to bomb and telling people to leave and go to a safe zone. That's the most moral army in the world. Well, okay, but the NBC and the New York Times have both documented on more than 200 occasions when the Israeli military ordered Palestinian civilians to move to safe zones that would be protected from bombing, only to bomb those exact locations hours later with 2,000-pound bombs, the heaviest bombs they have. They committed this horrific act more than 200 times, where they said, evacuate from here, from point A, go to point B. It's going to be safe in point B. And then when Palestinians concentrated in point B for safety, they bombed the hell out of point B. 200 times, more than 200 times. Even once is inexcusable. But when you do this more than 200 times, that's not an accident. That's policy. So what assurance can Palestinians have that this forced movement to move to a more concentrated part of Rafah is not just another cruel and illegal ploy to maximize harm and death of Palestinians? How do we know that? I mean, for God's sake, we have the saying, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Well, it's been over 200 times now. With what face can the Israeli military possibly say that we're acting in good faith? And with what trust are Palestinians supposed to proceed, notwithstanding that they have nowhere to actually go? And finally, and unfortunately, the US government is still defending Netanyahu and opposing an ICC investigation. In fact, as I mentioned earlier in the show, they're even refusing to release their own State Department report on whether Israel is committing human rights violations. It's wild. Antony Blinken has a report from his own State Department sitting on his desk from last December, admitting that the Israeli government is committing human rights violations and we need to stop arming them, and Blinken won't act upon it. The Biden administration's refusal to support an investigation into the Israeli prime minister or any Israeli government official is going to undermine trust in the White House. Despite the aforementioned media blackout, despite the mass graves, despite the threats to the ICC prosecutor, despite the refusal to accept a ceasefire deal, despite the indiscriminate invasion of Rafah, the US government still opposes an investigation. This is not international rules-based order, as we've often come to hear from the White House. And to reiterate, this is the same White House that supported ICC prosecutor Karim Khan's arrest warrant for Putin. But they will not support an arrest warrant for Netanyahu, even as he refuses to abide by the White House's instructions to engage in a ceasefire and to not invade Rafah. Deeply concerning, and it ultimately harms our ability to serve as a just arbiter on international issues, and which is even more remarkable, that Hamas is still willing to put the US down as a guarantor that it will be accountable to the ceasefire deal. I mean, the White House has to reverse course. I don't think they will, unfortunately. But reversing course is how we're going to actually uphold a sense of justice in this space. But the fact that they're refusing to is just incredibly concerning. What is the end game at this point? How do we ensure that we're holding people to a sense of accountability when we're not even willing to be accountable to basic international human rights law ourselves? You know, I was thinking about this a couple of days ago, and I came across just, you know, I mentioned earlier that this is not as complex as people are trying to make it. It's actually very simple. At the end of the day, there are 600,000 children in Rafah. They have nowhere else to go. If you support an invasion of Rafah, what you're saying at its core is that the lives and the well-being of those children just don't matter. That's what it comes down to. If you saw those children as your own, opposing the invasion wouldn't be a question. It wouldn't. And this is not to dismiss the value of the lives of the hostages. No, let's recognize that the hostages are there. Let's say, sure, they're all there. But if that was your children in Rafah right now, you can't tell me, yeah, let's go ahead and bomb the hell out of Rafah to get the hostages. My children be damned. You wouldn't say that. If you see them as your own, you wouldn't say that. And if you don't see those children, those 600,000 children as your own, it's because they've been dehumanized to you. And don't give me this line about, well, Hamas should stop using these children as human shields. They're not. They're telling you we want a ceasefire. They're telling you we want to release all the hostages and let there be peace. They're telling you this. So this is not a false choice of, well, we have to bomb them because Hamas is holding us as human shields. They're not. They're telling you. And they're putting the US down as the guarantor of it. So if you saw those children as your own, opposing the invasion wouldn't be a question. If you don't see them as your own, it's because they've been dehumanized to you. Otherwise, no person with a conscience would look at an innocent child, let alone 600,000 innocent children, and say, yeah, let's go ahead and bomb and kill them. Nobody says that. Nobody with any sense of conscience says that. And I'm reminded of the ever prescient wisdom of James Baldwin when he says, quote, "The children are always ours, every single one of them, all over the globe. And I am beginning to suspect that whoever is incapable of recognizing this may be incapable of morality." That's a powerful statement. And it's a comprehensive statement about the need for us to recognize the key importance here that these children are ours, all of them, every single one of them, all over the globe. It's critical that we restore a sense of morality and humanity by upholding international human rights law. It's critical that we protect these children and protect innocent civilians. That's why I say that's why I'm saying this is not a complicated decision for people with a conscience and moral compass. And again, if it really is about the hostages and you don't give a damn about anything else, the facts show that diplomacy has helped release more than 130 hostages. Bombing has released 3 of them, and it has killed 4 by the Israeli military shooting and killing them themselves while they were waving white flags. Bombing has not done anything to release the hostages. Diplomacy has, and here we have an opportunity. Israel has an opportunity to get back every single hostage, every single one. And they're saying no. It was never about the hostages. They're making that much absolutely positively clear. And that's what's most horrifying about this. All right, when we come back from break, I want to talk about expanding the Supreme Court, because where we are right now as a democracy is on the cusp of it being stripped away permanently. And I wanted to spend more time on this episode talking about Muslim and Jewish history and how much misinformation is being spewed about that, but we'll get to that in another show. But right now I want to talk about expanding the Supreme Court and really demonstrating that not expanding the court is what's completely contrary to precedent, to history, and contrary to our democracy if we want it to be a functioning democracy. And I know some of you are like, no, we can't expand it because of XYZ reasons. I hear you, and give me a shot. Give me a few minutes to explain that, and I think you'll understand where I'm coming from, in that this is designed not just to protect our rights in the short term, but to protect our democracy in the long term as well. You're listening to the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View Channel 126, the most awesome show in the multiverse. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back. You're listening to the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View Channel 126, the most awesome show in the multiverse. As always, a shout out to our Substack supporters as well. Let's talk about the Supreme Court and just how egregious this thing has become. I've done shows in the past, and I'll do some more in the future on how the Supreme Court has actually been one of the biggest stumbling blocks towards justice in this country. Everything from Dred Scott ruling that Black people are subhuman, to the stripping down of the Civil Rights Acts of 1875 that set our country back another century, to the Asiatic Exclusion League, to Thind versus United States banning all Asian immigration, to Buck v. Bell legitimizing Black genocide through eugenics, to Korematsu, legitimizing the concentration camps for Japanese Americans. The list goes on and on. But unfortunately, you would think that by 2024, things would have changed. They have not. And in many respects, we're seeing a continued stripping away of our rights at the hands of the Supreme Court. And we're dealing with this horribly unjust system right now, an unjust system where 4 Supreme Court justices nominated by presidents who lost the popular vote, confirmed by Senate, who represent 40 million fewer Americans than those who oppose. Those 4 get to strip rights that the vast majority of Americans loudly support, while secretly and frankly openly taking bribes from billionaires because they know they face zero accountability. That's where we are. And those same SCOTUS justices, Supreme Court justices, now weigh whether a president of the United States has unlimited immunity, as if that should ever even be a question to consider. I mean, common sense tells you he's a president, not a dictator. Why would anyone but a dictator have unlimited immunity? Apparently, that's a legal question that the Supreme Court feels it needs to even weigh, which is absurd. And yet, critics still say it's wrong to demand an expansion of our Supreme Court. Beyond the obvious and systemic deterioration of our rights, there are at least 3, there's more, but at least 3 reasons why we absolutely need to expand the court. So let's address this. But before diving in, let me just recap what just some of the rights lost under the Supreme Court of the United States entail. At a minimum, we have lost protections to clean water when the Supreme Court gutted the EPA and allowed toxic dumping in water. We've lost voting rights when the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act of 2006, which is an extension of the 65 Voting Rights Act. We've lost, obviously, reproductive health access when the Supreme Court overruled and flipped Roe v. Wade, which is, of course, a retraction of 51 years of settled law and precedent, and the 4 who voted to overturn Roe had previously agreed during the confirmation hearings that it's settled law. They lied. Which, as a side note, as a lawyer, if you get caught lying, you get disbarred. As a Supreme Court justice, you get caught lying, you get praised. I mean, it's nonsense. Wrongful incarceration. The Supreme Court has stripped away the rights for people wrongfully incarcerated to appeal and get a fair trial. Religion-state separation. They've allowed for funding, tax dollar funding, to be used for private religious school vouchers. Safety from gun violence. They've repeatedly struck down legislation that would have allowed for better regulations on guns. Fourth Amendment protections. They have allowed evidence obtained without a warrant to be used to prosecute somebody, which is fundamentally the whole point of what the Fourth Amendment is supposed to protect. Similarly, in Fifth Amendment protections. Anti-discrimination for being queer. They've shut down and struck down protections for LGBTQ Americans. Racial justice in education and the workplace. Talking about a repealing of affirmative action. Even though we've done shows on this in the past, we know affirmative action has benefited white women more than Black, Latino, and Asians combined. We know that legacy admissions is the true affirmative action for rich white families, where 43% of white students at Harvard, for example, got in through legacy admissions, non-merit based. And 3/4 of those would not have qualified on merit. But no problem with that. Let's focus on affirmative action. It's nonsense. Economic justice for students suffering predatory loans. The Supreme Court has struck down the ability to cancel predatory student debt, which is absurd. They had no problem and have had no problem with tens of trillions of dollars being canceled. They have no problem and have had no problem with tens of trillions of dollars being canceled in taxes, in corporate bailouts, but 1.7 trillion for students who've been exploited by a cruel system. Suddenly that's unconstitutional. And this is all just a snapshot, but you get the idea on how dire the situation really is. And elected Democrats who don't have the courage or the willpower or the foresight to demand we expand the court are severely underestimating the extremism of MAGA Republicans, especially with Trump now promising to establish a literal dictatorship. We just don't have time to waste. Democrats need to abolish the filibuster, expand the court, or we won't have a democracy to save. And so here are the core reasons why. First, expanding the court aligns with historical precedent. You heard that right. As the Supreme Court itself documents, the number of justices on the Supreme Court has changed 6 times in US history. 6 times before settling on the present total of 9 in 1869. As many changes as our nation went through from March 4th, 1789, the date that the Supreme Court was established, to 1869, the year of the last Supreme Court change in the number of justices, it's surely gone through as many or more significant changes since 1869, which justifies further expansion. And the thing is, we arrived at 9 justices in 1869 because we had 9 federal districts at the time. So it made sense that each federal district would ostensibly have, a proverbial level of representation. Well, guess what? Now the United States has grown, you may have noticed. Now we have 13 federal districts. So precedent mandates that we remain consistent and expand to at least 13 Supreme Court seats. So not expanding to 13 is the actual contradiction to SCOTUS precedent. Second, expanding the court aligns with the American population and demographic considerations. For example, in 1869, the US population was about 38 million people. We had 9 Supreme Court seats, so 1 for about every 4.2 million people. In 2024, the US population is about 336 million people. We have 9 Supreme Court seats, which is about 1 for about every 38 million people, which means that each Supreme Court justice today essentially accounts for the entire nation in 1869. Nonsense. Expanding the court will better ensure that the will of the people is heard, it's represented. Look, we're supposed to be a government by, of, and for the people, and that can't be lip service. We have to actually put it into action. And so in addition to better accounting for population differences, we have to ensure that the Supreme Court accounts for demographic differences because representation matters. Here's what I mean. Of the 116 Supreme Court justices today, their demographic is breaks down as follows. 1 Black woman, 1 Latina woman, 2 Black men, 4 white women, 108 white men. So in other words, white men, while only about 30% of the US population, represent 94% of the Supreme Court. Meanwhile, the rest of America, which is about 70% of the population, we represent about 6% of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is supposed to reflect the American people. It's not meant to be this racially or gender exclusive club. And so we have a very simple solution. Expand SCOTUS and begin to ensure more accurate representation of all Americans. It's fundamentally, that's it. And if you don't like that, think about it this way. Would you feel the same way if throughout Supreme Court history, you had 108 Black women on the court and 1 white man? Wouldn't you want more representation? Of course you would. It's only natural, it's only human to want to have representation because your lived experiences are unique and different, and you want people in power who understand your lived experiences and are willing to rule based on justice accordingly. But critics protest that, well, that's just packing the court. And that's wrong. I remember a couple of years ago when Justice RBG passed away, a MAGA voter objected that to me exactly. He said, well, Democrats just want to pack the court. And this is, I think, around 2020. And I said, okay, let's talk about packing the court. Let's talk about how Republicans have won the popular vote and won out of the last 7 presidential elections, but have nominated 14 of the last 19 Supreme Court picks. Let's talk about how Mitch McConnell denied President Obama's appointments of an unprecedented 110 federal judges and a Supreme Court appointment. And then those 110 appointments were then appointed by Donald Trump with conservative judges, mostly white male. And then the Supreme Court pick denied to Obama was then given to Trump. And let's talk about how Republicans made a rule to not appoint a SCOTUS justice in an election year, which is why they denied it to Obama. But then they appointed Amy Coney Barrett in an election year after voting had already begun. You can't accuse Democrats of a hypothetical event that never happened while ignoring the actual court packing done by Republicans. Which brings me back to my earlier point, that Republicans will absolutely break any rule, violate any ethics standard, and avoid any accountability to the law if it means one thing, that it gets them more power. That's what they care about. And we know this because that's what they've done to pack the federal court on the appellate level and how they've packed the Supreme Court with the supermajority 6-3 conservative court. And hence, my third point on why we need to expand the Supreme Court, ethics. The Supreme Court desperately needs meaningful ethics reform to regain its legitimacy. And that just won't happen with the current Supreme Court. A recent Gallup poll shows that while the Supreme Court enjoyed a remarkable 80% trust rating in the late 1990s, it is now at a historical low of just 49%, and it's dropping. And this is not by accident. Repeated reporting shows that numerous billionaires lavished millions in undisclosed gifts to Justice Thomas and others, and he disclosed none of them. And it doesn't stop with Justice Thomas. Justice Alito has repeatedly ruled on cases in favor of corporations like Exxon while holding Exxon stock without recusing himself, making himself even wealthier with his rulings. Justice Kavanaugh, Barrett, Alito, and Thomas all committed to respecting Roe as settled law. They lied because then they voted to repeal Roe. Americans are rightfully outraged. They feel unheard and they feel lied to because that's all that's happened to them. They've been lied to. And this corruption is the exact reason why Supreme Court justices are required to disclose gifts and financial benefits to make sure that they are not compromised. And the fact that there's no accountability for this overt corruption, I mean, for God's sake, Justice Thomas is ruling on an insurrection case when his wife helped fund and ignite the insurrection without recusing himself. And this is just another reason why we need to expand the court to at least 13. We need to bring some sense of balance back to the court. And the thing is, while we are running out of time, it is actually not too late yet. Democrats can still stand united to abolish the Jim Crow filibuster, which, by the way, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. loudly condemned in his day. Democrats can abolish the Jim Crow filibuster. They can vote to expand the court. They can vote to add at least 4 more seats to make it a 13-member Supreme Court. Doing so will be aligned with historical precedent, aligned with America's population, aligned with America's demographic realities, and aligned with ethics and integrity that our court is supposed to uphold. And if nothing else, polling shows that 2 out of 3 Democrats, 66%, want to expand the court. These are Democrats who elected Democrats for a reason, and so elected Democrats should finally listen. Because failure to act is not just going to result in continued degradation of our fundamental rights as Americans, but it's going to result in a dissolution of American democracy itself. We have to expand the court to save our democracy while we still have a democracy to save. Because once we lose the ability to vote, as the Supreme Court is enabling, once we lose the ability to have basic reproductive health access, as the Supreme Court is enabling, once we lose the ability to have clean water and a clean environment, as the Supreme Court is enabling, there's nothing much left to save. And that's the scariest part of all. But we have time. We just need to act quickly. All right, guys, thank you for tuning in. I am going to make a plug. I have launched a Substack, and so far it's going extraordinarily well. You can just go to my Twitter, go to any of my websites, Qasim Rashid Substack, and subscribe to that. I really hope you guys do. You can subscribe for free. You can subscribe for paid at $5 a month, $50 a year, less than a cup of coffee. And just check it out, because the goal here is to recognize that we need more clarity on human rights. We need to have a platform that can describe these issues that people see as complex and break them down so they're easier to not only understand and digest, but then to act upon and bring about meaningful change. Media is supposed to be doing this, but unfortunately, we're seeing them fail at this. It's why only 32% of Americans support legacy media right now. It's fundamentally flawed because it's based on a for-profit corporate model as opposed to a for-truth integrity model. And that's what I'm trying to build out. If you can subscribe, please do. If you can subscribe as a paying member, definitely do, because that helps fund the work. But the goal here is to be kind of the Wikipedia of human rights platforms, where you can come to this platform and know that the facts put forth are unassailable, they are cited with receipts, and that they will provide guidance on how you can move forward and be more engaged in protecting our democracy, protecting our society, protecting our basic human rights. Thank you all for tuning in. Be sure to follow me on social media at Qasim Rashid across all platforms. You have my promise to continue to advance a show that builds on compassion, justice, and accountability for those in power. Got a great show lined up for next week. Be sure to tune in, same time, same place at 10 a.m. on Sunday on Sirius XM Urban View Channel 126, the most awesome show in the multiverse. And again, a big thank you and a big welcome to our Substack family as well. My friends, be fierce, lead with compassion and justice, and continue speaking truth to power. Till next week, peace.